So, the Ready Player One guy wrote a book of poems. In a bizarre connection to the Jordan Peterson poetry collection I reviewed a few months ago, this one also actually has pictures. In fact, exactly like the Peterson book, every single poem has an accompanying drawing, this time courtesy of cartoonist Len Peralta. I don't love the style of these personally, but that's like a purely subjective thing. It's not to speak to their quality. It's not like Peralta was even given the best material to work with. At the very least, most of them are pretty creative, and some of them add some nice flair to the poems, but they're a little bit of a delight, so that's that. So, if you've heard of this collection before, it's probably because you came across the semi-viral Reddit post containing the text of the extremely uncomfortable poem Nerd Porn Auteur, in which Cline's speaker advocates for this kind of geek-flavored misogyny that's actually totally progressive, because the women it sexualizes are, like, good at math, rather than being, and I quote, pathetic, or vacuum-headed bunnies. Either that, or you heard me read the entire poem on the English Club podcast episode, where we critiqued Ready Player One. But let me back up. Hey, if you haven't joined us here at the St. Balasar University English Club before, welcome. I'm Jay, and together me and my co-president Andrew take the books the internet has decided suck and critique them as if they had been brought to us for a fiction workshop. Here on the YouTube channel, Andrew and I each tackle literature within our respective specializations. So for me, that's mostly poetry, and for him, that's mostly weird internet fiction. Today, I'm taking a look at every single poem in Ernest Cline's The Importance of Being Ernest. Before we start looking at the poems individually, though, a little bit about the collection itself. So, the title of this book takes its name from the Oscar Wilde play, The Importance of Being Ernest, which is a comedy roughly about fancy people getting into fancy antics. Cline's book, too, has comedic aspirations, which Cline mentions in the collection's introduction. Some of these poems didn't actually begin as poems, Cline writes, but rather as, God's help us, stand-up comedy routines Cline performed in Ohio sometime in the late 80s and early 90s. When he was in his teens and 20s. After moving to Austin, Texas, Cline apparently changed gears to performing slam poetry that incorporated his, quote, geeky sense of humor, more on that soon, and many sets of air quotes around humor. Many, if not all, of the poems in this collection are the texts of the slam poems Cline performed at a venue called the Electric Lounge, where, according to him, he won their annual slam contests, which he describes as like an Olympic event, before eventually graduating to the National Poetry Slam, which unfortunately he didn't win. Something that isn't super germane to this conversation, but that I do find interesting, is that Cline's wife, since 2016, is a poet whose work you can find on poets.org, which is a pretty reputable archive of both contemporary and historic poetry. Cline's poems, in contrast, don't appear there. Evidence of his slam poetry does appear, however, in the Performance Poetry Preservation Project, which is an archive dedicated to the collection and storage of recordings of old slam performances. In their database, you can find several CDs on which Cline is recorded reading his poems, including ones that don't appear in the book at all. Unfortunately, it doesn't look like the good old PPPP has uploaded any of the recordings themselves, so I wasn't able to listen to them. However, there's lots of really interesting CD covers if you feel like giving their website a look. The reason that I'm interested in these recordings is pretty simple. The poems in this collection are, spoilers, not good. There's no way of getting around it. They're all bad, every single one. So I have to imagine that if Cline won actual money reading these, and he claims he did several times, his stage presence must have been excellent, or there must have been some other secret sauce he was able to slather these things in to make them appeal to people. I mean, the guy made it all the way to the National Poetry Slam. The same year that the city of Austin sent him to represent him, they also sent someone with a master's in creative writing, a doctoral student, and several people whose work had appeared in big-name literary magazines like Prairie Schooner and Beloit. Whatever this secret sauce was that made Cline successful in the slam poetry space, we might never know. These poems' past lives aside, Cline has given them to us in book form today, so I'm going to critique them accordingly, which is to say, as contemporary literary poetry. Another note about the book that will affect the way I talk about it today. These poems are explicitly autobiographical, and Cline is not shy about intentionally equating himself with the speaker. From the introduction, quote, I think most of them still hold up pretty well, and serve as a great time capsule for who I was, as a person and a writer, during that time in my life. Elsewhere in the introduction, he characterizes these pieces not as poems, but as monologues in which he shares his actual authorial perspectives, whether about old video games or jobs he formerly held. Not that the categories of monologue and poem are mutually exclusive necessarily, but as we'll see, these pieces often seem to forget that they're meant to be poems and become pure armchair philosophizing. This speaker really wants to talk about himself and his experiences and have someone listen. Even the title suggests as much. It is important to be Ernest Cline. Ernest Cline matters, and we ought to listen to him. Speaking of the title, which appears on the cover, we see several iterations of Cline dressed in a variety of pop culture-inspired outfits, posed dramatically in front of an urban landscape as though ready to spring into superhero action. Like Cline's speakers in the poems that will follow, even if these men are wearing different outfits, they're all essentially the exact same guy. Even though Cline has given us every reason to conflate speaker and poet, including the fact that he is literally depicted as the speaker in all but a few of Len Peralta's drawings, I will not be doing so today. Not only is it against the ethos of the English Club, but as we'll see, this speaker, seemingly without realizing it, casts himself as a pretty troubled and unsavory individual, and I don't want to allege anything about Cline's actual personality that might be untrue or do harm. With that in mind, let's talk briefly about the role of the speaker in poetry. The fact is, all poems have speakers. We talked about this a little bit in the Jordan Peterson episode, but even those poems which wanted to pretend to be sort of universal and not have a speaker did have them. It's all but impossible to escape the reality that a poem is being conveyed to us via the subjective position of the person doing the telling. Even if a poem purports to be from the perspective of an omniscient figure like a god, because the writers, that is to say we ourselves, aren't objective creatures, we can't write truly objective poems, and that's actually okay. We learn a lot about a speaker in the short space of a poem, because poems often narrate deeply meaningful experiences. While we may not learn much about a speaker's actual biography, what we will get is a very intimate look into their interior world, their obsessions, their fears, their desires, their beliefs. A good poem is vulnerable, in the sense that it reveals a part of a speaker's private interior landscape to us. We get, you might say, to use a cliche, a peek right into their mind. While many poetry collections contain poems from the points of view of several different speakers, this one is special in that we have one continuous speaker throughout. It's therefore pretty important that we understand this guy and his worldview. I mean, even if we don't like him, we need to at least understand who he is so that we can glean something by viewing the world through his eyes. For that reason, his worldview needs to be coherent, and when it contains inconsistencies, which all of our worldviews inevitably do, the author needs to intervene in some way to convey to the readers that he's aware of the speaker's contradictions, and is using those contradictions to create commentary on the real world. Still following? Great. With all that in mind, how are we introduced to our speaker? When I was a kid, adults used to bore me to tears with their tedious diatribes about how hard things used to be when they were growing up. What with walking 25 miles to school every morning, uphill both ways, through year-round blizzards, carrying their younger siblings on their back to their one-room schoolhouse where they maintained a single straight-A average despite their full-time after-school job at the local textile mill where they worked for 35 cents an hour just to help keep their family from starving to death. And I remember promising myself that, when I grew up, there was no way in hell I was going to lay a bunch of crap like that on kids about how hard I had it and how easy they've got it. But now that I've reached the ripe old age of 28, I can't help but look around and notice that the youth of today, you've got it so fucking easy. In many ways, this is the perfect introduction to the collection, though perhaps not in the way Cline imagined. The poem could be divided into 3 parts. First, the speaker bemoans childhood experiences in which adults belittled his struggles by insisting that their own were much worse. In the second, which goes on for 2 pages compared to the first's 2 stanzas, the speaker gives himself permission to do the thing he just criticized. Then, in the third section, he realizes what he has just done and makes an attempt to self-correct, spending all of a single couplet joking, "Wow, I'm just 28, and the time I grew up in really wasn't all that long ago after all. Isn't it funny that I, as a 28-year-old, am acting like an old man?" You don't really get to do this. You don't get to say, doing the thing is bad, then do the thing, and then say, haha, isn't it funny that I did the bad thing, and just expect that we'll all laugh. All you've really done there is be a hypocrite and then pretend that your awareness of that fact somehow negates it. There's nothing within the 2-page rant about how easy kids today have it that would suggest the speaker is being in any way facetious. He's literally just doing the thing he implied ought not be done. So, what do we learn about our speaker over the course of this poem? Well, he's 28, he's kind of a hypocrite, he's a little bit curmudgeonly, and, this is key, he's mad at people. In this case, it's the kids who live excessively cushy lives, at least in his view. All in all, it's a pretty thorough introduction, and one that sets us up nicely for a pretty clear character arc. This guy has a lot of room to grow, and there's a certain amount of self-awareness that he could gain about himself that I think would make for a compelling story. Will that arc happen? You decide. The Geek Wants Out. This poem is essentially about how our speaker pretends to be quote-unquote normal, when in reality he's just such a geek. Normal is a pretty loaded term that could be explored in a lot of depth and would make one, if not several, interesting poems, but this poem isn't interested in that, so I'm going to skip over unpacking it. Instead, I'm going to focus on this geek part. When I say geek, I want you to hear consumer. The bulk of this poem is little more than a list of IPs Cline's speaker enjoys, interspersed with reminders that the speaker doesn't like quote-unquote normal things like sports or literature. You might ask why he's writing poems, then. I would ask that. There are upwards of 20 properties mentioned in the poem, with any individual one scarcely being given more than a line or two's worth of space. Slate writer Laura Hudson, in a review of Cline's novel Armada, criticized Cline's overuse of this kind of reference humor, which she referred to as cultural hyperlinks. This is an absolutely brilliant metaphor, perfectly encapsulating the way Cline name-drops IPs without using those names to actually do anything. As we saw in our review of Ready Player One, point to the thing that exists is one of Cline's staple jokes, the other being, quote the thing that exists. This poem misses a really big opportunity to make, or guide the reader, to fall in love with any of these properties too, or, alternatively, to use these properties, whether their contents or what we associate with them, to make a larger point. The poem is super invested in letting you know that the speaker likes these things, but he gives little hint as to why, or what they do for him. Maybe that critique is a little bit too ethereal. Here's another way of thinking about it. Lots of poetry is about other media, but crucially, it's not just about the media itself. Rather, it's often about the speaker's experience of encountering that media. The classic example of this is Rilke's ekphrastic poem Archaic Torso of Apollo, which details the speaker's inspiration to change his entire life after beholding the ancient statue that, even in its shattered state, radiates a luminous power. Another example, and a poem I happen to like a little bit more, is Percy Bysshe Shelley's Ozymandias, not named, you'll note, after the Watchmen character. Ozymandias simultaneously mocks human desire to outlive death through art, while itself reproducing that desire and, in fact, affirming one's ability to do so. It's a pretty old poem, after all, and it's describing an even older piece of art, and we remember both. If you're interested in learning more about Ozymandias, the poem, not the Watchmen guy, I can highly recommend David Mickick's essay on it, available for free on the Poetry Foundation's website. He and I have slightly different readings of the poem, as you'll see, but our disagreements are part of what keeps conversations around art interesting. There are newer poems than Rilke's or Shelley's that do the same thing with more contemporary media. Hell, I have a poem inspired by horror RPG Amori coming out in Legia magazine this spring. The main takeaway is that referencing or writing poems about media can be done, and done effectively, so long as the poem aims to do more than just describe the media itself. I guess, before we move on to the third poem, I should probably pause and do some micro-level critique, since this does claim to be poetry, after all, and poetry is about noticing the little details more often than not. To be honest, it's pretty tough to do line-level edits on this, because the book really uses so few of the techniques of poetry. Here's the opening of The Geek Wants Out. At first glance, I probably appear to be a somewhat ordinary, somewhat average-looking fellow. Calm, harmless at least. But this is by design. You see, it is through decades of research and rigorous training that I have crafted this facade of normalcy. Andrew will be throwing this up on the screen, so you'll notice right away how uncontrolled the line lengths are, and that they make almost no interesting decisions about where to enjam. They could be worse, but they aren't doing anything unexpected or exciting either. You'll also notice the way the stanzas function sort of like paragraphs, in that a new stanza begins when a thought has reached its terminus and a new one is beginning. This isn't a bad choice, per se. There's a long history of doing this in poetry, but again, it's not particularly interesting. Here's how I might relineate these stanzas to make them at least a little zestier. At first glance, I probably appear to be a somewhat ordinary, somewhat average-looking fellow. Calm, harmless at least. But this is by design. You see, it is through decades of research and rigorous training that I have crafted this facade of normalcy. To be frank, I don't like this very much either, but let me walk you through some of the choices I made. I enjammed the first two lines in order to maintain a sense of tension until the third, which is then end-stopped. The next few lines are end-stopped as well to keep things sort of punchy in the middle. Then I broke the long sentence into 4 lines so that it becomes somewhat less unwieldy, and to highlight the words decade, training, and facade. I think emphasizing decades is especially important here, since it informs us about how much effort the speaker has put into this persona. Just like in the first lines as well, I think that keeping the last several lines enjammed right until the very end builds tension as we escalate into the ending of the introduction of the poem. What this enjambment can't fix, though, is boring diction, a lack of strong images, and a near total absence of metaphor. Trust me when I say that this section of this single poem is characteristic of the entire collection in terms of both form and content, with only a few exceptions that I'll mention as we come across them. That just about wraps up all of the line editing I intend to do for the rest of the video, because frankly, this poem and this book aren't ready for edits on the level of the line. These poems really need to be rethought from the ground up, and making line edits is a waste of time outside of being a purely academic exercise. The third poem in the collection is Bottom Bunk Messiah. In this poem, our speaker tells a humorous anecdote in which he gets Jesus as a roommate. One of the reasons this one fails is that it's never clear whether it's meant to be literal or figurative. That is, if Jesus is a metaphor, or if he's a real roommate and this is just some kind of weird extended joke thing. In the poem, Jesus does all of the things you'd expect Jesus to do, only sometimes they're reskinned to make more sense for this college roommate aesthetic Cline is going for. For example, Jesus turns water into beer instead of wine. Other times, though, things from the Bible stories just literally occur. On Easter, for example, Jesus is arrested by Romans, like Romans, like the literal ethnic group. The speaker makes a joke that this is part of a, quote, hazing ritual, and that Jesus just faked his own death, appearing 3 days later, but that still doesn't explain the presence of the actual Romans. Jesus does do a couple of unexpected things that approach comedy, like destroying the speaker's copy of Life of Brian, but overall the jokes in the poem are just, Jesus did this thing. Here, again, Cline demonstrates his inability to think of jokes other than mention IP and quote IP. It's just that this time, IP has been swapped out for Bible. Oh, and for what it's worth, this poem is framed in the context of the Jesus roommate having replaced our speaker's previous roommate, a, quote, dim-witted, misogynistic, knuckle-dragging, football-playing, business/physical education major whom I had considered killing in his sleep on several occasions. So I guess we should add threats of physical violence to Cline's repertoire of jokes, since we're going to be seeing that one a lot more in the next few poems. Viewers keeping track of the threads present in the book will also notice that this is another instance of Cline introducing a guy into a poem just so he can be mad at them, just like he did with the kids in the collection's opening poem. The speaker goes on to recount how this former roommate ended up in jail, whereupon the speaker says he remains interred, quote, at a Cincinnati correctional facility, where, if there is any justice, he is being sodomized on hourly shifts. That's right, our speaker's idea of justice involves regular and premeditated sexual assault. Even if the roommate did commit, quote, date rape, as Cline's speaker alleges, that doesn't mean he should have his own consent and bodily autonomy regularly violated. Again, Cline didn't have to put this guy in the poem at all. He put him there just so he could A, insult him, and then B, wish this brutality upon him in the public venue of a published book of poems. This is weird to me, but moving on. After Bottom Bunk Messiah, we have the infamous, you know it, you love to hate it, nerd porn auteur. And frankly, when I came across this one in the collection, I thought, no, I'm not reading this again. We already talked about it in some detail in the Ready Player One episode of our show, and I'm not going to rehash everything I said then now. Suffice it to say, Cline uses the venue of the poem to put down the types of women he finds unattractive, that is, fit, traditionally feminine, overtly sexual, athletic, and sexualize those he's into, which are nerdy, good at math, play Dungeons and Dragons. While it wouldn't fix the poem by any stretch, it might improve it to spend more time focusing on what he does like, rather than using roughly half the space of the poem just to put other people down. Again, this wouldn't fix it, but removing the parts where he's just shitting on people would at least remove some of the bad stuff, even if what remained was also bad. But for whatever reason, he just can't seem to help reminding us how little he thinks of people who enjoy things that he doesn't enjoy. After Nerd Porn Auteur, we have a poem called If Nostradamus Were a Guidance Counselor. Like Bottom Bunk Messiah, this poem momentarily pretends to be about a metaphor for something, but it's not. Barely even a poem, this piece takes the form of a rant told from the perspective of this Nostradamus cast as guidance counselor type character, really just a costume worn by the same speaker we've gotten to know thus far. Formally, this poem does do something interesting in that the moment the poem's tone intensifies in severity, it switches from lines to regular old prose paragraphs. However, this backfires, risking undermining the entire collection. By revealing how little putting the poems into prose alters them, this piece actually draws our attention to a question I've been asking since the beginning, which is why these are poems. That said, this poem does reveal some interesting facets of our main character's personality. For one, it conveys to us that he enjoys having an audience who will sit down and listen to him. The poem literally begins with Nostradamus sitting a young pupil down and beginning to prognosticate his future. The student is given no voice and can only listen as Nostradamus hurls increasingly insulting predictions his way. Speaking of those insults, they reveal a second facet of our speaker, which is that he's a very fearful individual. This is how he describes the student's post-graduation life. About this time you'll marry someone you meet at work and don't really love, but hey, let's face it, you're not getting any younger. You'll cheat on them out of sheer boredom, at which point you'll realize that you've spent the majority of your adult life deep-throating corporate without ever doing anything remotely creative, and that when you die, the only thing you're gonna leave behind is a pile of empty Prozac bottles and 1.6 children who hate your fucking guts and swear to God they will never be anything like you. Remember, Cline is about 28 years old as he's writing these, so for him, the experiences Nostradamus is describing are purely hypothetical. The speaker then ends the poem thusly. Then they'll stick your geriatric ass in some tomb of a retirement community, where you'll live out the remainder of your empty, pathetic, miserable life. Actually, I'm just f***ing with you, Johnny. Don't worry. It's all gonna work out. For me, this reveals the purpose of the poem. It's literally just projection, not just on the part of Nostradamus onto Johnny, but also of the speaker out into the real world. There's no joke here at the end, no commentary. It's just fear and anger vented onto the page, and I don't know why someone would write this, unless what they wanted was an audience to see and hear them as they express their fears about the future. Not that these fears are even invalid necessarily, no. It's just that this isn't really what poetry is for. Poetry isn't diary entries, and the fictional Nostradamus framing device fails to disguise the fact that this is essentially a diary entry. Hey, Jay here. So I want to get out ahead of any comments that hear that last little bit of analysis of this poem and think, wait a second, there is a joke at the end of that poem. Nostradamus changes his mind at the end and he says, don't worry, Johnny, it's all going to work out. That sudden tone shift is a joke. But what I'd like to point out is that even if that is a joke, the reason that Nostradamus would change his mind there and that the tone would suddenly switch is to reinforce the idea that, no, it will not be okay, which then reifies my interpretation of the poem, which suggests that this is just fear being sort of like vomited out into the world, and that this poem is really a diary entry that portray someone's real anxieties about their future. And again, I don't want to belittle the anxieties themselves or the real discomfort that those anxieties can cause in a person, but since this is like a a text, this is a real book of poems that was sold for money, it can be critiqued. Next up, we have a poem called Cunning Linguistics. And what can I say? This title is a little clever, if gross, given what we know about our speaker's views of women. The poem is pretty similar to Nerd Porn Auteur in several ways, including that it makes up athletic, masculine guys to be mad at and to belittle. The poem opens, "I have heard other members of my gender, in their more philosophic moments, during locker room, living room, and road trip discussions about sex, never intimacy, about fucking, never making love. As both a boy and a man, I have been witness to these testosterone-driven debates about the pros and cons of one or more of the seemingly infinite number of angles from which it is possible to penetrate a woman." The tone works to give away how little the speaker thinks of other men and to establish him as someone who thinks he knows better than others and enjoys looking down on them. This pattern is continued into the following lines, which lament the state of, quote, "unenlightened Neanderthal frat boys who, quote, continue to feign intolerance at the taste or the smell while boasting about the size of their phallus, all of them leaving a sea of unsatisfied women in their wake." My issue with this poem, other than the misogyny, of course, is that the speaker here misuses his power as our narrative guide. See, as a reader, we expect a poem to be some degree of made up. After all, poems are not after recording exact fact. On some level, we anticipate that a poem will be artifice, and that the speaker therefore has the power to make up that artifice, while nonetheless asking us that we believe them on some level. In short, we are suspending our disbelief. For the speaker to use this power to demean other people, that is, to create fake people for the explicit goal of elevating himself above them, is to betray his bitterness. How does this contribute to our understanding of the speaker? Well, it's clear this isn't a meta-commentary on his unlikable character. The speaker wants us on his side, and the poem doesn't give us any information to suggest that we should feel otherwise. The poem even ends with a call to action for straight men to give their female partners more head. At the end of the day, we're supposed to leave this poem impressed with how progressive and special the speaker is for considering his female partner's sexual desires. He wants us to applaud him for this extremely basic act of considering another person's needs. Here again is a moment where I want to draw an important distinction. I mean, the thing that he is asking men do is not unreasonable or bad. I would say it's probably even a good thing. But the reason that he's doing it is not to benefit women, it's to elevate himself above men he considers lesser. And I don't know why the collection would want to draw attention to that fact and then not let us know that it knows that he's being kind of a shithead for it. The only conclusion that I'm left to draw is that the book itself doesn't realize how unpleasant its speaker is. After that poem, we have tech support. There's really not much at all to say about this one. It details the speaker's annoyances with how stupid the people calling into tech support lines are. Even though he's doing the same thing he's done previously where he's making up people to be mad at, I'll give him a pass on this one, because I've worked customer-facing jobs and I get how frustrating they can be. I will say, though, that this poem has one of the collection's most compelling opening stanzas. It contains a collage of ways Cline began tech support calls back in the day, and that polyvocality creates an interesting effect. He could have used the space of the page to better convey the simultaneity of these utterances and to create a visual and sonic overwhelm, but in its current list-like state, it's the beginning of something pretty good. After tech support comes the title poem, The Importance of Being Ernest. This is the center of the collection, which is a pretty sensible place for a title poem. It's not uncommon that a collection would place its title poem in the beginning, middle, or end, so again, even if this isn't a particularly interesting choice, it's a very solid one. The poem details Ernest's fraught relationship with his name, but unfortunately it isn't all that interesting in the way it goes about doing so. In the opening stanza, he imagines and insults the nurse who might have written his name on his birth certificate, describing her as some blue-haired, gum-popping hospital secretary. I don't understand why he introduced this woman only to put her down, but I do think it's an interesting opportunity to point out the power of a small word in poetry. That "some" at the beginning of "some blue-haired, gum-popping hospital secretary" really adds an extra air of vehemence to this statement. Like, he really doesn't like this blue-haired woman and her bubblegum. The poem also makes yet another reference to porn. This happens quite frequently, not even counting the poem all about porn, so that's another thing that seems to be on the speaker's mind quite a bit, even when thinking about his own birth. Next up, we have Curriculum Vitae. This poem contains an overlong screed about the speaker's dislike of job applications, which, okay, fair enough. There's an opportunity for and a gesture towards humor here. The poem begins as straight-faced descriptions of his frustrations with the job seeker's life, and then attempts to humorously escalate into the absurd, but the pacing is all kinds of wrong. Early in the poem, the speaker states, "I enjoy working with people. I work well as part of a group. I can give orders. I can take orders." None of which, based on the rest of the book, I believe, for what it's worth. By the end of the second page, the speaker has escalated to talking about knowing how to do things like swing dance and being willing to try being gay if that will help him get the job. I can see what Cline is going for here, but then his speaker begins threatening violence against the silent job interviewer. "I have been known to fly into vengeful fits of homicidal rage when I get turned down for a job by some self-important, balding, baby boomer fuckhead like you." As we saw in Bottom Bunk Messiah, he's making physical threats of violence against a person he made up. There's not a joke here, it's not comedy, it's really just anger, and in that anger he misses another opportunity, which is to criticize or critique the material societal conditions that force reliance on such a terrible system of job seeking. But again, he would rather just yell at someone he made up than delve into a more complex issue. After Curriculum Vitae, we have a poem called Airwolf. I have dedicated 3 sentences to it in my script, and they are as follows. This one is a total bust. It's about Airwolf, a TV show Ernest Cline likes. All of my critiques of The Geek Once Out apply here. I think that's all I'm going to say about it. If you want to Google Airwolf, you can. There's also something in the introduction about how for a while Cline was part of this online push to turn Airwolf into like a viral adjective. Basically just means awesome. It's no wonder this didn't catch on. It sounds really cringe when you use it in conversation. Describing something as Airwolf it's so early 2000s, try hard, random, quirky internet. I'm glad it never caught on. Next up is Pick 6. In this piece, which is about deciding to play the lottery out of desperation, we return to the speaker's dislike of corporate life. The poem is likewise invested in performing a dislike of consumerism. In the speaker's words, "But the other half of you sees a rat race ripcord you could pull to eject yourself out of the whipsaw cycle of production and consumption that your life has become." Remember what I said at the beginning of the video about needing to understand Cline's speaker? This is one of those moments where our understanding of him is disrupted by a contradiction in the speaker's behavior. Despite previously having dedicated entire poems to his admiration of various franchises, suddenly he's anti-consumption. Now, I'm not saying consumerism is when enjoy franchise. Of course not. Consumerism is more like when you base your entire personality around what you consume. Just as a random example, pop culture IPs from the 80s and 90s. Consumerism is when you write an entire book that's about 90% references to said IPs. Consumerism is when you then go on to view yourself as some kind of renegade outsider because the things that you consume are less popular and therefore secretly better. Following on the heels of that, we have Curtains. This is what I'm going to call the book's off-ramp. The poem is essentially a list of ways you could die. Most of them aren't particularly creative, and the ones that aren't conveyed in a very interesting way. After the list is done, the speaker attempts to segue into a cliched, "this is why you should appreciate your life," moralizing little stanza, before ending off, "to say and do all the things you intended to do right now, as soon as you get around to it, first thing tomorrow." This one was one where I really wondered if it hit different when it was performed live. I'm not sure, and I kind of doubt it, but if anyone saw Cline perform in Austin back in the day and wants to get in touch, please let us know in the comments below, or in the Twitter DMs, or via email. all of which are linked in the description. I would love to hear about how that went down, and if you have a recording of it, even better. Next up on our off-ramp is Cinema Verite. Here, we find our speaker on trial. He's on the stand, offering his closing arguments in defense of his crime of mass murdering an entire movie theater's worth of people. Note that he's admitting his guilt, but attempting to argue that his crimes were justified. Each person he killed interrupted his viewing experience in some way, and the poem proceeds as a list of what the individual disturbances were and how the speaker killed them. Bizarrely, all of the killings are neck-related. 2 types of strangulation and another involving the breaking of a guy's neck. At the end of the poem, the speaker insultingly pivots into this charade that all along this poem has really been about the importance of art, and in particular the sanctity of the cinema. The speaker says, "Because nothing else has the power to move and enlighten the masses, like the flickering vicarious light of moving pictures. If everyone would just shut the fuck up and watch the goddamn film." It's really ironic to me that this book, which cares so little about the medium of poetry, its tools, and its history, purports suddenly to be invested in paying proper respect to a particular art form. And yet, again, as we saw in The Geek Wants Out, it doesn't tell us anything about why the speaker holds these opinions on film. Instead, it just asserts that he does. This posturing about the meaning of art will be important in just a second, so hold on to it. Before arriving at the collection's closer, we have to make a pit stop at a series of 3, frankly very lazy haiku. Each one describes the plot of an IP Cline likes. Are you tired of hearing me say that yet? For instance, here's the Galaga one. "To defend Earth from the evil alien hordes, I need a quarter." I picked this one because it at least understands that in many formulations of the English language haiku, the 3rd line operates like a volta or turn that offers an unexpected observation which complicates or recontextualizes the 2 preceding lines. In this case, we think in the first 2 lines that the poem is literally about defending Earth from literal evil aliens. The 3rd line recontextualizes that reading, causing us to realize that the speaker is actually someone who exists outside the reality in which Earth is threatened, and that to him, this is a low-stakes game. That twist, allegedly, creates humor. That said, the enjambment on "from" in the first line is really, really weak, and in a piece as short as a haiku, it's kind of inexcusable. I mean, you only have 3 line breaks. You gotta get them all right. Finally, we arrive at Dance Monkey's Dance, the ultimate piece in the collection. Cline appears to be especially proud of this one as its name appears in the introduction, alongside the claim that it was at one point viral online. I couldn't find any recordings of it that had reached view counts I'd consider viral, but it's possible that the videos have simply been taken down since he published this collection. In any case, the piece is, in essence, a rant about how little human lives matter on a grand universal timescale. The speaker likens humans to monkeys driven primarily by thoughtless biological impulses and fated ultimately to unceremonious deaths. While the speaker concedes that us monkeys, quote unquote, have accomplished impressive feats of engineering like, say, the Great Wall of China, he bemoans the harsh realities of war and human loneliness. I'd read some of it, but I promise none of it is interesting, and you've likely heard it all before. If you've ever sat half stoned with a bunch of friends around a campfire and been like, "Hey man, doesn't it suck that in society you kind of have to change parts of yourself to fit in?" And everyone else was like, "Yeah man," then you've as good as read this poem. Actually, I would argue that what you've done is better, because you've had an authentic experience with people you love, which this poem can never hope to provide. I've talked on this channel and on the podcast previously about the lyric moment, which comes to us from scholar James Longenbach and is essentially the idea that a poem, when read and understood, is not just a text, but is actually an experience that the reader has. The poem triggers a variety of emotional responses and intellectual associations that cause literal changes in the reader's body, even if only momentarily. Very simply, if you read a poem and it makes you happy, then that poem has caused you to have the experience of happiness, which is in part the result of chemicals happening in your brain. Therefore, it's not really unreasonable to claim that a poem has biochemically changed you. And to me, that's really meaningful, because the poem has reached into you and become part of your biology, your material reality, again, even if it's just for a minute or two. To speak briefly about the speaker's monkey analogy, there's an extent to which I kind of agree with him here. As a vegan poet, okay, how many people do you think clicked off the video right there? As a vegan poet, bear with me, I recognize the animality of human existence, and I wish more people would recognize it too. But, crucially, not with the end goal of in some way reducing or diminishing humanity. Humans are animals, and animals aren't on a lower tier of a made-up hierarchy than humans are. To me, there are just animals, some of which are human and some of which are not. And so I wish Cline, if he were going to speak from this worldview in which humans are animals, would choose to be empathic towards his subjects rather than attempting to tear them all down. The speaker then makes this really bizarre move that I think ultimately undermines the whole project. At one point, Speaker Cline states, "Some of the monkeys think they have it all worked out. The monkeys argue about Nietzsche, without giving any consideration to the fact that Nietzsche was just another f***ing monkey." When I read that, I had like 800 thoughts happen at the same time. So here are several things I want to point out about that stanza. First, the "some monkeys think" line is probably one of the best lines in the whole collection, in that, by highlighting the fact that the monkeys can think, the poem calls attention to the idea that we're meant to believe the opposite, which is a neat effect. Second, I don't think Nietzsche ever claimed to have everything figured out. It's like the speaker wants us to think of this as hyperbole, but the poem hasn't really prepared us to read it that way. The poem as it's written centers human irrelevance while treating any individual, Nietzsche, or collective Great Wall of China accomplishments as exceptions. As a result, we're left with the impression that the speaker is embittered for some reason or another, and is eager to tear down the accomplishments of a successful philosopher, whatever you might think of Nietzsche's actual works. Third, to insist on the irrelevance of human achievement is a dangerous move for a poet. To dismiss Nietzsche out of hand isn't just to reject this guy, it's also to reject his experience, that it has any meaning or significance. Let's take this thinking to its logical extreme and suggest that no one should do anything, including writing or reading this book, because, after all, we're all going to die. Now, I know that Cline doesn't really believe this, whether or not his speaker does. Cline can't believe this, having written this book. I mean, clearly he's spent a lot of time with poetry, and the medium means something to him, whether or not he really understands it. In fact, we know that art in general means something to him because he just ended the previous long poem with what was meant to be a stirring speech about the importance of cinema and its ability to change us and teach us things. This poem is so bizarre in that it undermines the book's entire undertaking, which is, in essence, to share a series of humorous poems so that we, as readers and as human people, can have shared a laugh and thereby be more connected, even in some small temporary way. An Ernest Cline fan, if there is any such person, and I salute you, might argue that Cline realizes what he's doing and is winking at the audience, suggesting in the conclusion of the poem that of course this is all a joke, of course existence isn't futile, and our human experiences do matter. But I defy you, hypothetical Ernest Cline fan, to find a shred of textual evidence that this is the case. If you're out there, I look forward to seeing you in the comments. So, the book wants to connect us, I think, but fails in doing so because it denies its own relevance in its final pages. Okay, unless, of course, that isn't the aim of the book at all, because there's another possibility. One I first began to suspect as early as the introduction. The sad truth about this book isn't that it outs Cline as a misogynist, or as a guy with an unhealthy relationship to porn or IPs, or just as kind of an angry dude. It's that it reveals this speaker's deepest desire, which is simply to be put in a space with people who will listen to what he has to say. Cline's speaker feels so unheard that in the Nostradamus poem, if you remember, he literally has to make himself into a figure of authority, a guidance counselor, and trap a hypothetical student in a room with him so that he can have someone listen to what he has to say. At the end of Dance Monkeys Dance, Cline writes, "These monkeys are at once the ugliest and the most beautiful creatures on the planet. And the monkeys don't want to be monkeys. They want to be something else. But they're not." This is a speaker who wants deeply to be more than what he is, which is a guy that consumes media so that he can publicly reference the fact that he's consumed media. He wants to be more than this soy jack of a man that just points at things he likes and casts himself as the Chad in shower arguments with imaginary jocks. I don't think it's a coincidence that this book came out in 2013, which is 20 years since they are first performed, but just 2 years after Ready Player One's success. Cline had, for a moment, the culture's attention, and therefore an opportunity to repeat what he had gained from these pieces decades ago. So, if you, like me, are wondering why these are cast in this book as poems rather than the monologues that Cline seems to want them to be, it's a question, I think, of what slam poetry allowed Cline to do back in the 80s and 90s. Remember, to Cline, these are monologues first. They began as slam poems, meaning Cline would literally get up on a stage and speak them to an audience who was expected to listen, and had maybe even paid to be there, maybe even traveled across the country, say, to the National Poetry Slam, to be there and hear what the guy on the stage had to say. These moments must have made Cline feel seen and heard, and yeah, I get it, that feels great. Which makes it all the sadder that he uses the space of his final poem to diminish the importance of human connection, the thing I think his speaker wants most, but is afraid to admit. Hey everyone, if you made it this far, thanks so much for watching and or listening. If you liked what you heard here, feel free to check out our backlog of videos, including a breakdown of Jordan Peterson's poetry book, which I did previously, a breakdown of some of the poems written by Persona 4 Golden's Marie, Andrew's video on Empress Teresa, Andrew's video on Sonic High School, or some of the episodes of our podcast. If you liked this video, you might like the one where we reviewed Ready Player One. It's a little older at this point, but I think it holds up pretty well. My favorite of ours is probably the episode where we talked about Nova's playlist. I had a ton of fun breaking down this absolutely wild book that blew up on TikTok. Thanks again for listening, and I hope to see you around campus.